guys, thank you so much for coming today. And I think you being here reflects really the timeliness of our speaker's address today. And before I go into his introduction, let me just introduce myself. My name is Nahid Bidali. I'm an infectious diseases physician, and I'm actually an associate professor at the BU School of Medicine. I run the BU Center on Emerging Infectious Diseases, which focuses on public health and policy research to build resilience against emerging infectious diseases threats, which of course are often found in the middle of conflict, in the middle of mass movement of peoples. Which brings me to our co-sponsor for the event, which is the Center on Forced Displacement. And Dr. Mohammed Zaman, who's here, is the director of CFD as well. Today's speaker, Jeremy Konyndyk, is really at the intersection of what both of our centers tackle. Jeremy is a committed humanitarian advocate, seasoned emergency operator who's served in senior appointments in 2 U.S. administrations, one alongside my time in the Biden administration. Jeremy was at USAID when I was at the White House COVID response team. So his prior appointments were prior to his current appointment as the president of Refugees International. In between these appointments, he's worked as a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development, focusing on humanitarian response and pandemic preparedness research. In addition, Mr. Konyndyk has served a range of U.S. and overseas non-governmental organization leadership positions, including as a country director in West Africa and East Africa with the American Refugee Committee, now called ALITE, and as a policy director in Washington, D.C. with Mercy Corps. He's currently a member of the World Health Organization's high-level independent oversight advisory committee and has served previously as the U.S. representative to the board of Gavi, which is the Vaccine Alliance, and the Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs Donor Support Group, which is at the UN. He's also worked with U.S. Department's State Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migrations. And having personally known Jeremy for about a decade now, since Ebola, Jeremy is an advocate for those in our world that are heavily affected with emergencies. I've known him to be passionate in the work that he's done throughout, and he's always on the right side of things. So I'm really excited for him to speak today. Thank you so much.
There we go. Good. Well, hey, everybody. As Nahid said, I'm Jeremy. Now I lead Refugees International, which is a fabulous advocacy organization focused on refugees, displacement, and humanitarian issues. But a lot of my career, particularly over the last decade since Ebola, has focused on that intersection between humanitarian crises and health crises. And when I first got involved with Ebola in 2014, and I'll talk more about kind of how we approached that response in the talk, those were really separate worlds. The global health and the outbreak response community and the humanitarian response community were very distinct from each other, very little overlap in terms of professional expertise, personal relationships. We lacked a common vocabulary. And so a lot of my work over the last decade has been to try and bridge some of that and bring those two communities together. So it's really cool to be here and kind of see that intersection happening in real time at BU. But what I want to talk about for the most part today is what's happening to both those worlds right now due to the ongoing attack within the Trump administration on the entire kind of ecosystem of actors that provide humanitarian assistance around the world and that address global health threats around the world. So to give you a quick rundown for those of you who maybe, I'm living and breathing this, but I know not everybody is. So the short version is when the Trump administration came in on day one, they did a few things. Well, they did a lot of things, but a couple that are germane for this. One, they issued they ordered a foreign assistance review and a full pause on all U.S. foreign assistance. And they also pulled the United States out of the World Health Organization. And a few days after that, on the 24th of January, they went further and they did a full freeze, not just on any new humanitarian or any new foreign aid funding, but they actually froze all U.S. government foreign aid activities around the world, issued stop work orders to all U.S. government partners who were receiving foreign aid funding, and also halted any payments even for work that had previously been completed during the Biden administration, so not even paying out invoices for work completed. And what this has done is pretty rapidly create an extinction level risk for the U.S. foreign aid sector. It has taken organizations that are, have done hundreds of millions of dollars worth of work with the U.S. government very reliably for many years, and suddenly stiffed them for their bills. So organizations are now within days to weeks of going bankrupt. Many of the largest kind of name brand relief organizations in the United States, if they survive this, will survive it at maybe a third to a half, generously, of the size that they are now. They are all laying off staff. They are all pulling back programs. And what this means in practical terms on the ground is at U.S.-funded HIV clinics, people are being turned away at the door when they show up to get their antiretroviral treatments. The U.S. supports about 20 million people around the world with antiretroviral treatments. And that is a major bulwark against a resurgence of global HIV transmission, which we're about to lose. It means that in real time, as we're talking here, in refugee camps around the world, in displacement settings around the world, US-funded humanitarian relief programs that save lives day in, day out are being halted. It means in Syria today, and I just had colleagues of mine in Syria last week, programs to clear unexploded ordnances and mines from residential areas are have been halted. Those are programs that are pretty vital to refugee return now that the country is, fingers crossed, beginning to stabilize. So refugees will not be able to return to those areas if they still are littered with mines and unexploded ordnances. All of these things are distinctly life-saving interventions. Secretary Rubio had promised repeatedly in public and to members of Congress that life-saving work would not be halted. It is being halted, and this kind of culminated yesterday when a wave of cancellation notices was sent out by the State Department, canceling more than 90% of USAID's global programs, and that included many programs that had already actually gotten waivers from Secretary Rubio. So it is just total chaos. I think the technical term would be an utter shit show, and it is going to kill people. It's already killing people, and it's going to kill a lot of people. And what this is driven by is basically an active campaign of disinformation against the foreign aid sector and against foreign aid providers, led by Elon Musk, amplified by President Trump. And some of you have probably seen this. If you're kind of in this world, you've probably seen some of the reporting on what Elon Musk has been putting out there, and calling USAID a criminal organization, calling it a ball of worms, which is a really weird thing to say. As some of these things have been kind of vetted by the press, it's all BS. Like none of it is accurate. But it is serving its purpose, which is to kind of create a public impression that USAID is a compromised organization, and the only thing to do is to shut it down. I'm not going to try and rebut all of the lies from Elon's Twitter feed. I will just say, I think one that has gotten a lot of attention and that is particularly egregious / on a dark level kind of hilarious is this claim that they had stopped a shipment of $50 million worth of condoms from going to Gaza. And that has, that hits a few buttons because it's Gaza. So, people get their dander up in a lot of directions around Gaza. It's condoms, so it feels like something related to sex. So that's got to be like juvenilely hilarious. So they have pushed this and pushed this and pushed this. It's completely false, and it's been debunked by every media organization on the planet. But just to underscore how ridiculous it is, so I've done a lot of work in public health and reproductive health. And so when I heard that figure, my first question was, I wonder how many condoms that is. Because the USA buys a lot of condoms for global reproductive health programs, HIV programs. Average cost is about 4 to 5 cents per condom. So if you do the math, 50 million would be 1 billion condoms. That's a lot of condoms for 2 million people in Gaza. So it's an absurd thing. When you put it that way, it's absurd on its face, but that just underscores there's no attempt to connect any of this to any reality. And that's a very frightening thing if they can destroy a federal agency based on such just complete horseshit. I hope I can curse, be you, right? It's okay. So what we are seeing basically is the destruction of U.S. foreign aid. And rather than rebut each of the lies that we've seen from Elon Musk and the president, what I want to do is talk about the USAID that I experienced. So I served at USAID during most of the second term of the Obama administration, leading foreign disaster assistance, which is basically all of the kind of humanitarian response operations. And then came back for the first 2 years of the Biden administration when I worked with Naheed. And there I was leading COVID relief in the kind of final high point phase of the pandemic. And what I saw was not a criminal organization. What I saw was not anything like what's being just, it's very like surreal to kind of see the descriptions of USAID and of the foreign aid community that have been in the social media ecosystem for the past month. And it really is a disinformation campaign, because what I have, what I have known is an organization that is highly imperfect. And if we had 3 hours, I could tell you all of my complaints with how USAID works and the UN system. That would be another 3 hours. But highly imperfect, but also incredibly necessary, staffed by incredibly dedicated people. And most of the imperfections are things that are basically imposed by Congress, not things that USAID willfully chooses. It's things that Congress imposes as accountability measures, or to kind of track money, or to ensure fair and open competition on every single dollar that is spent, and things like that. And that just creates a lot of bureaucracy that USAID is not choosing but has to comply with. And the kind of miracle of USAID is that despite all of that, despite all of those kind of bureaucratic impediments that are imposed on the organization, it still does incredible work and it achieves incredible things. And so I just want to tell a couple stories about some of the things that I was involved with, and that I think capture some of the essence of what USAID is and does. And so Ebola is one of the first of those. That's the first one I'll talk about. So in 2014, the largest Ebola outbreak in history began. A young boy in a town called Meliandou in the forest region of Guinea, which is near where Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia all come together, is believed to be the index case. It's not entirely clear how he was exposed, but he became infected. He infected several other members of his family, and from there, the outbreak spread. And because this was an area where there had not been a recorded Ebola outbreak before, although it looks like there probably had been some small ones that were just never detected, it was able to get a real head of steam. And by the summer of 2014, it was spreading across Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea at really explosive rates, doing things that we had never seen Ebola do before. We'd never seen Ebola hit an urban center. It hit several urban centers. We had never seen the kind of explosive spread, and it was not really thought possible that you could see that kind of explosive spread with Ebola, because it is such a severe virus. It would burn itself out after a few hundred cases. So the largest prior Ebola outbreak had been about 400 cases. And this one was 28,000 cases by the time it was all said and done. So it was just orders of magnitude larger. And we didn't really have a playbook for that. So the whole playbook for how you combat Ebola was premised on small, mostly rural outbreaks of a few hundred cases, where you'd never have more than maybe 50 cases needing treatment at a time, and a few hundred contacts of those cases needing to be monitored and isolated. So when you take that and you scale that by several orders of magnitude, it's very hard to scale those interventions. It's very hard to scale an Ebola treatment center. It's a highly, highly specialized facility, and you have to get everything scrupulously right, because if you don't, people get infected. A friend of mine, Craig Spencer, who teaches at Brown, who was serving in that response, got infected while he was there. He was working for MSF. He was likely infected while he was doffing his personal protective equipment after coming on a shift at one of the shifts in the hot zone at one of the treatment units. And he got infected. He survived. He's healthy. He's fine, thankfully. But it underscores, you can be extremely, extremely careful and still get infected. It's an extremely dangerous thing. And so these Ebola treatment units have to be run extremely rigorously to avoid infecting the workforce there and to avoid infecting larger parts of the population. And there really wasn't a ready way to do that. And so what we began doing at USAID in partnership with the Liberian, initially the Liberian government, and then also the governments of Sierra Leone and Liberia, and in partnership with some of our NGO partners and UN partners, was just really workshopping this problem. Piece by piece, first off, how do we get these things built? Okay, who's got a blueprint? How do we get these things built? We ended up pulling in the US military for a lot of the construction because we needed to stand up 25 to 30 of these things at one time across the region. So we pulled in the US military and they came in support of USAID's mission there to do that piece of it. How do we scale up the lab? So we began pulling in labs from the US Navy. They have amazing biolabs to do diagnostic testing. Then who's going to run these things? So if we can build 25 clinics, who's going to actually run the clinics with the rigor required? And we ended up bringing in Partners in Health, International Medical Corps, International Rescue Committee, Save the Children, International Organization for Migration took some of on. We went to the humanitarian network because these were sort of like a small refugee camp, because you have you have basically, this is a residential facility. People are living inpatient in this facility. So you have sanitation, you have clean water, you have feeding, you have shelter, you have all the kind of in miniature, all the components of a camp, paired with an extremely rigorous health facility. And well, who has those skill sets? It's largely humanitarian organizations. So we went to a bunch of humanitarian organizations. MSF did an amazing training curriculum for them. And we just began supporting the training of those organizations in real time to get their own facilities up and running. And we did manage to get, I forget how many, something on the order of 25 to 30 of those things activated in the space of a few months, which is a miraculous achievement. Never been done before, never been needed before. But that wasn't the only thing. We needed to block chains of transmission as much as we could. And what we realized was a lot of the transmission was happening through burial practices. In many of the affected areas, traditional burial practices would involve the whole community coming together, relatives traveling from around the region, sometimes across borders, which is probably how it began spreading initially. In that part of West Africa, the major communities are really kind of on both sides of all those borders. And I happened to live in Guinea and work in Guinea for 3 years early in my career, and so was pretty familiar with some of these areas. And I talked to colleagues who were from the forest region of Guinea, who had family across Liberia, who had family across Sierra Leone. And so, in that kind of a case, if a member of that family dies, people travel from around the region. They go to the burial. The burial ritual would often include washing the body, and many, many members of the community touching and embracing the body. And it's a really beautiful practice. And it is also, you couldn't in a lab design a better way to transmit Ebola. Because a body is most infectious at death. It's when the virus needs to move to another host in order to survive. So, and it's when, of course, a lot of deaths from Ebola involve emitting, hemorrhaging and emitting bodily fluids, and that's where Ebola virus is contained. So it's a perfect way to spread Ebola. So you could have one of these burials that would expose 100 people and maybe infect half of them. So one case, one unmanaged burial, one unsafe burial, you could suddenly have 25 to 50 new cases. And that was how the explosive, so we realized as we were kind of digging into the data, that was how the explosive spread was happening. So we did something that had never been done before. We set up burial teams. And we funded NGO partners to do safe burial support, to identify cases in the community that, where people had died in the community, where they would be, the community would get some training and awareness on how to safely bid farewell to their loved one. We would provide special body bags that could contain the virus and prevent transmission. And it was not just a sort of technical operational piece. There was a really major cultural engagement piece to this, because as everyone knows, burial practices are extremely culturally sensitive topics, and changing that and convincing, persuading a community to change that. It's extremely difficult. It feels like, it feels like losing your loved one a second time if you can't say goodbye to them properly. And that was what we were up against. And so there was an incredible, along with just the kind of technical and operational pieces of running the burial teams, an incredibly important cultural component and cultural engagement and sensitivity component to how we did that. And it was extremely successful. And I think ultimately the burial teams probably had more to do with containing the outbreak, at least in the case of Liberia, than did the Ebola treatment units. None of that had ever been done like that before. And without USAID, it would not have been possible to do it. We had obviously the resources. We had the partner network. We had the operational expertise, and within USAID, and particularly USAID working hand in glove with the Centers for Disease Control, we could marry up the virological, biomedical piece of the strategy with the operational piece of the strategy into a really effective whole. And that's what we're losing. That's the sort of expertise, the ability to do that kind of operation is basically gone now, unless this is, it's not too late to be recovered, but it soon will be. But what what is happening right now is shutting down the Ebola team. They're following 2014, there was a permanent Ebola team stood up at USAID. That's now been disbanded, notwithstanding what Elon Musk said in the cabinet yesterday. The disaster assistance response teams, the teams that I used to deploy to Ebola, to famines, to earthquakes, that whole infrastructure has been dismantled as well. If there were an earthquake somewhere in the world tomorrow, the search and rescue teams that the U.S. has routinely deployed, consistently deployed to any major earthquake over the last 50 years, those teams can no longer get off the ground. Yesterday, the State Department actually canceled the contract with one of those teams, the LA County Search and Rescue Team. So that's a piece of what we're losing. We're also losing the ability to do things like the operation to support Yazidi refugees who were fleeing genocide in 2014 at the hands of ISIL. So if you remember, and this is actually around the same time as Ebola was kicking off, which was a pretty intense time for USAID. But as ISIL was surging across northern Iraq, they particularly targeted an ethnic and religious minority community in Iraq called the Yazidis, who were neither Muslim nor Christian, were quite distinct from the other ethnic and religious communities in Iraq, had always been sort of outside of the mainstream of society and vulnerable because of that, and they were targeted for genocide by ISIL because of it. The town that they lived in was called Sinjar, and it was next to Mount Sinjar, and so many of them who were able to survive the initial assault fled up the mountain. And we then scrambled in the U.S. government. We scrambled in the U.S. government to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Is there a way we can protect these people? Can we keep them alive? ISIL was at the base of the mountain, but hadn't yet chased them up. There were also forces on the backside of the mountain. So ISIL was basically kind of surrounding the mountain range on all sides. The Yazidis were at the top, and they were able to hold off ISIL briefly, but not for long. And so USAID then worked extremely closely with the U.S. military to figure out how to protect that population. So U.S. military, the U.S. Air Force began conducting strikes along the mountain sides, on both sides, to prevent ISIL from being able to go up to the mountain to where the Yazidis were. So that was the first step, to just prevent them from being completely overrun, to protect that population. But of course, they were on the mountain with no shelter, no food, no water, no anything. So we then worked with the Department of Defense to take USAID relief commodities, put them on DoD airplanes, and airdrop those onto the mountain. And so we began doing nightly airlifts to drop life-saving relief commodities onto Sinjar Mountain, so that the Yazidis who were stranded up there could just basically stay alive. I mean, it was not much, but it was enough to keep them from death. And then, very fortunately, one of the militant groups within Syria, this was just below the Syria-Iraq border, came and pushed ISIL out of the areas on the backside of the mountain, and that enabled, after I want to say a week or so, I forget exactly how long, as it enabled the Yazidis to then flee down the backside of the mountain, make their way through Syria, and then come back into Iraq, in a different part of Iraq that had not been taken by ISIL. And that saved tens of thousands of lives, that operation. People who would have otherwise been overrun. The stories of the Yazidis who did not make it out are horrifying. Many were killed, many women were enslaved and sexually abused over many months by ISIL until they were rescued. So it was an extraordinary operation, and again, not possible without the expertise that USAID provided. We had the relief commodities, we had the expertise on what this population needed, we had the contacts with the communities on the mountain. So DoD did the flying. We did the things that made the flying meaningful, possible, and targeted appropriately. And so if you take USAID out of that equation, we lose that. And a lot of that population would have been wiped out without what we did. The third one I'll talk about is something called FuseNet, which is an amazing, was, and hopefully is if it's ever recovered, is an amazing mechanism that the US government has funded for several decades now to anticipate and predict famine risk. So FuseNet stands for the Famine Early Warning Systems Network. And it initially started as a way for USAID to basically figure out where its food commodities needed to go. So USAID delivers a lot of food aid commodities around the world. They purchase things from American farmers, put them onto ships, and ship them all around the world. And you need to have some idea where those ships are going to need to go, because it can take several months to ship things from a port in the US to wherever it needs to be going around the world. So you need some ability to predict 3 or 4 months out where the greatest food aid needs are going to be 3 or 4 months from now, and then you send the ships there so that you can kind of run to the ball, or skate to the puck, to use a sports analogy. And so FuseNet was initially created as a way to help USAID do that, to look at economic factors, climatic factors, other conflict dynamics, and use that to model and predict where would the greatest food aid needs be, where would the greatest hunger needs be over the coming 3 to 6 to 12 months. And then that would be used to allocate where the US food aid was going. And over time, this became an amazingly sophisticated model and tool that didn't just predict where food aid commodity needed to go. It could predict with a lot of precision where food crises were emerging, how close they were, whether there was a risk of them tipping into full-blown famine, and what sort of interventions would be needed to avert that kind of an outcome. And so it was, it helped the US government with its just kind of day-to-day, where do we send our food problem, but it also actually became a global public good, because it could hold it could hold the system honest, could hold the global system to account. There is a system through the UN for declaring famines. It's called the Integrated Phase Classification System, which is like the worst name ever, shorthanded to IPC. It's a 5-phase system, so sort of like if you've ever heard of like a Category 5 hurricane, we also have Category 5 food emergencies, and those are called famines. But the IPC is controlled in part by governments. And the IPC process to declare a famine has to have the concurrence of the government of the country affected. And as you can imagine, for a lot of reasons, governments rarely want to admit that they have a famine on their hands. Usually when you have a famine, it's because the government is causing it in some form. FuseNet played a really, really critical role in keeping that system honest, because the participants in the IPC process knew if they came out with something that was out of step with FuseNet, people were going to trust and believe FuseNet and not the IPC. Now, the IPC is very good, it's very rigorous, but it has an element of kind of political influence that FuseNet didn't have. So FuseNet was both something very useful just to the kind of day-to-day work of the US government and USAID, but also actually helped the whole humanitarian system to work in a more transparent way because of that setup. That contract has also been canceled now. So, these are the sorts of things that USAID actually does and did and hopefully can do again someday. And the risk of what we're seeing now, and I'll wrap up here in a minute and we can kind of have a Q&A. But the risk of what we're seeing now is, the expertise that USAID has built up is not something that you can just toggle on and off every 4 years. So if it is wrecked now, and it's very close to being unsalvageably wrecked, like within days or weeks of that, if that is lost, if the staff who hold that expertise disperse and go and take other jobs, if the partner network, this incredible ecosystem of nonprofits and contractors that carry out USAID-funded programs all around the world to the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year, if that partner network collapses, and it is on the brink of collapse right now, rebuilding that, which has, that network evolved over decades of partnership, of sustained, trusting partnership with USAID, that will not be recoverable. That will take decades to recover. The expertise that USAID has. I used to say when I worked at OFDA that every great system we had was built on a past mistake. Because what we would do after every major crisis was evaluate how we'd done, take a really, really hard, rigorous look at how we'd done, and where we'd seen mistakes, we would make adjustments and fix them, and we would come back and do it a little differently the next time. And when you do that over a 30 or 40 year period, you develop really amazing systems that when you lose them, you lose that process that has produced them. You can't just put that back together again without going through that learning again. It's a little bit like, so Toyota has this thing called total quality management in their manufacturing process, where they do incredible manufacturing, incredibly efficient manufacturing because they iterate in that way. They find a little mistake somewhere, they fix it. They find an efficiency somewhere, they fix it. And the only way to do that, you can't design something up front that way. The only way to learn that is by doing it. And that's true of a lot of USAID's work as well. There are refinements, there are lessons that you can't concoct these things in a log frame. You got to get out on the ground and do the work. Learn the lessons, make the adjustments, keep the lessons, and do it a little differently and a little better the next time. And when you do that over decades, you get a really high impact organization. That too is what's being lost. And none of this, and I'll kind of end on this point, this is really relevant beyond just USAID, because none of this is lawful. There's a lawful way to dissolve a federal agency, and it involves going to Congress and the administration having a dialogue with Congress about, okay, we don't think this organization should exist, or we think it should be changed fundamentally. That has not happened. There is a process for changing how federal funding is spent. And it too involves going to Congress and saying, okay, we don't think we should spend any more money on this, and having that dialogue with Congress. That also has not happened. There's a process for firing federal workers. That too has not happened. So all of this is being done, and basically what Elon Musk and a guy named Pete Morocco, who's at the State Department, who's basically the architect of this estate, what they're trying to do is a kind of speed run, totally outside the law, to destroy USAID and to destroy, more broadly, to destroy US foreign aid in general, before the courts or the Congress can catch up to them. Because the courts move slowly, Congress moves really slowly, and if you don't have to follow the law, you can move really fast. And that's what they're taking advantage of. So they're basically gambling that if they can destroy USAID within the first couple months of this administration, before Congress or the courts catch up to them, that by the time Congress does get involved or the courts do catch up, it won't matter. It'll be too late. And they'll be issuing whatever legal decisions or any legislative changes over the smoking carcass of what was once USAID. That's basically the play. And that's really terrifying, because that is not just a USAID problem. That is a US government problem. If there is a precedent established that the executive can do this, can get away with this, they could also do it to Social Security. They could do it to the Defense Department. Parts of the Defense Department. But they could do this to any part of the federal government. And the other really chilling thing is this is going to kill a lot of people. There are tens of millions of people around the world who depend on U.S. assistance for their HIV treatment, for their daily food, for the clean water that they need to survive. If that's all pulled away, it will kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And that does not seem to be a bother to the people who are driving this within the government right now. And I have to think that if they are that cavalier about killing people overseas, it's not too much of a leap to think they would be similarly cavalier about killing people at home. And that's a very frightening thing. So what's happening to USAID is obviously a USAID problem, but more broadly, it may be a harbinger of what's to come for the U.S. government and for Americans and people living in America over the next 4 years. And so I think that's why it is really important, and why my organization and a lot of our peers and a lot of people on the Hill are trying to fight this, are trying to push back on this, because whether or not you care about foreign aid, and I imagine like this room probably cares a lot about foreign aid, but even if you don't, the model that's being tested here is deeply destructive to life and deeply destructive to democracy, and that's a very frightening thing. So sorry to end on a downer, but that's kind of been where things are lately. So with that, I will pause, and I'm happy to take your questions for a little while. Sure. Do we have a mic?
Perfect. Okay, I'm Abigail. So because, Elon and just all of U.S. government feels like right now just doesn't care about life and just truly the right thing to do, are there any ways currently being done, or what could be, that we frame it in a sense of, oh, this is actually good for business? Like, is there any ways that, we could somehow frame it, unfortunately, just in this time, that, okay, this is actually, because obviously they don't even understand like the political soft power of having it. No. So what about business? Like, how can we frame it like that?
There is a lot that USAID does. There is a lot that USAID does that supports U.S. business interests, and I think some of the strongest arguments we've seen have been, for example, the food aid that is purchased from U.S. farmers. You've got U.S. farmers that are losing markets right now because of this. Billions of dollars of business to U.S. farmers is being blown up by this. A lot of business for U.S. pharmaceutical companies that produce some of the generic drugs that support HIV and other health interventions also being blown up right now. And then market promotion and value chain promotion. A lot of USAID in many countries invests in agricultural commodity production. A lot of the cocoa that goes into U.S. chocolate bars, those value chains, USAID has invested in those value chains, in coffee value chains. So, it does have a direct, if sometimes indirect, or sorry, it does have a link, if sometimes a somewhat indirect or secondhand link to U.S. business interests. I don't think they care. But there are some people there are definitely some members of Congress who care and who've been making noise about the food aid piece in particular and the HIV piece in particular. I do think the health element is the outbreak element of this is really important too. I mean, there's a reason why Elon admitted to an oopsie on the Ebola front yesterday, because they know that's a bad thing. They know it's a bad thing to push out the Ebola team during the midst of an Ebola outbreak. He then, of course, lied in saying they brought them back when they actually haven't. But so there are some political vulnerabilities here, and I think a lot of what we who are trying to push back in DC have been doing is exactly that: is finding what are the things being lost that are going to be politically salient, that touch on U.S. prosperity, that touch on U.S. security, in ways that even someone who doesn't really care about U.S. doing good abroad, which actually a lot of people do, but even someone who isn't motivated by that will still care about.
Hi, thank you for this, Jeremy. My name is Mohammed Zaman. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering and run the Center for Forced Displacement. So there's critique and criticism from the right, but there's also some from the left, right? Of USAID, perhaps this notion of soft power is not without its own set of problems. This idea that ultimately it's an arm of a U.S. government. People in Pakistan, where I'm from, or people in Gaza would point to plenty of examples. And one, I want to sort of comment for colleagues here that you have spoken up about it. The lack of transparency, the lack of acknowledgement of this harm and the suffering because it is driven by political power. Is there real conversation within the broader community to reflect on that part as well, that you have not sort of always taken the right, not you, but USAID has not taken the side of the people who are vulnerable
Yeah.
for a variety of political reasons.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is a government agency, and the reality of the global humanitarian system is it is a system created by governments and mostly financed by governments. There are a few players in that system who are not mainly financed by governments, so MSF, Doctors Without Borders being probably the biggest one. And MSF is able to be much more forward-leaning on advocacy than a lot of other organizations. The organization that I lead now, Refugees International, we also don't take government funding, and part of the reason why we are able to be very out there on things like this issue, on things like Gaza last year, is because we don't have to worry about alienating the U.S. government. When I was in the U.S. government, and and from talking to colleagues, and I wasn't there during the most recent war in Gaza, but from talking to a lot of colleagues who were, I mean, there's kind of two things. You see one kind of public narrative from USAID, which usually has to kind of publicly toe the party line to some extent. But then within the administration, most USAID administrators and leadership try really, really hard to be the voice of conscience within the policy process. And we usually lose, but we try. And it's important to have that voice there. And sometimes we win. We in the Saudi war on Yemen in 2015, USAID pushed really, really hard, albeit mostly behind the scenes, for the administration to lean hard on the Saudi government to allow aid in, to stop the blockade, to allow fuel. A lot of parallels actually to Gaza, except it was a lot more successful in the case of Yemen, not fully so, but I think it did at least prevent what would have been an epically massive famine from tipping from IPC4 into IPC5, which is still not great. Having millions of people in IPC4 is still devastating, but relatively less so than being in IPC5. And it did really curtail some of what the Saudi government was trying to do. And particularly, we managed to circumvent the blockade the economic blockade that they had imposed on Yemen through some maneuvering at the UN. And without USAID being at the table, that would not have happened. So, it's always the sort of dual act of being in government. Like publicly, you have to toe the party line. Privately, you're trying to push for something better.
I'm Stanley Mohalo. I'm from BU SPH, School of Public Health.
Yeah.
I'm a doctoral student there. I could connect to some of the things you said because I worked during the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone and Liberia.
Okay.
And it was such a horrible experience because I was there from the beginning. And when we were able to, together with all the partners, I could testify firsthand the impact of the USAID, CDC in, rolling out different intervention and supporting the host countries in addressing the Ebola outbreak. And I also worked in a program, the Malaria Initiative, Presidential Malaria Initiative, before joining BU.
Yeah.
One of the things maybe we are missing out is ability to amplify the story of the effect of aid as a soft power, but also using it to touch life. I don't know if there are forums whereby people can be well informed about the impact of USAID. Not everything is wrong, but it has been able to touch lives and improve, help that pregnant woman have that ANC, getting all those life-saving interventions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think what was so powerful about the Ebola response was the support to the leadership of the host countries. So, it was Dr. Tolbert Nyanswa in Liberia who was running the show. And we were in support of him. CDC was in support of him. DOD was in support of that whole apparatus. And that was really vitally important to making it work. And we actually saw really interesting differences from country to country. Liberia by far had the best leadership of the response. Tolbert was incredible. Sierra Leone changed their incident manager over and over and over and over, and it really made it harder to have a kind of sustained strategy. Guinea was never got as bad as the other two countries, but was actually much harder to stamp out because there wasn't a sense of urgency from the government there the way there was from Sierra Leone and Liberia. And so, it was a very differentiated approach, but figuring out what did each of those countries need in order to succeed and trying to support them in doing that. And, that was really the core ethos that we brought to that. And I think we do need to tell those stories. What we're seeing right now is it's a very classic tactic, even though it's now happening on social media rather than, the sort of propaganda tactics of the 1930s. It's the same basic approach, which is to just flood the zone with a huge amount of with such a volume of misinformation that the truth can't catch up. And you cannot go case by case by case by case and rebut every single lie. And actually, if you do that, you're just kind of playing their game, because then the only thing you're talking about is the stuff that AID didn't do or doesn't do. So I think it is really important. It's why what I wanted to do today was just talk about the reality of what does USAID do? What does foreign aid achieve? How does it help the United States? How does it help the people the U.S. is trying to support? And I think, to the previous question, I think what is really unique about U.S. foreign aid is it kind of exists at that convergence of interests and values. So yes, like the U.S. as a U.S. government official, I always knew that I was working in the U.S. government's interest. That was the goal. But I also understood the U.S. government to have a very strong interest in saving people's lives around the world. The U.S. has a strong national interest in doing that. We have a strong national interest in controlling the global HIV epidemic. We have a strong national interest in combating malaria. And we have an interest in that both because it is not good for the U.S. to have uncontrolled epidemics around the world. That's not good for American health and security. It's not good for the global economy to have, as we had in the early 2000s, to have 30 to 40% of the populations of some countries living with HIV, untreated HIV. That is a huge risk to the world. And so, doing the right thing is also doing the right thing can also be doing the strategic thing. And, where USAID tries always to situate itself is kind of at that convergence. Not always perfectly. There are definitely programs, especially some of what USAID funded in Iraq and Afghanistan in the post-war, that I think were poorly done. But that is generally the exception. Most of the programs do live at that convergence of interests and values. And that really is different from, say, how the Chinese government approaches its foreign aid cooperation, which is just much more purely about economic interests and kind of extracting economic opportunity and concession through their aid program. So there's a reason you don't see China pouring billions of dollars a year into combating global HIV. There's a reason you don't see China pouring billions of dollars a year into global food global agricultural production, and the U.S. does, and countries know that. And so it is a different model, and it is that kind of difference in model differentiates the U.S. in our relationships with those countries we cooperate with, and we're at risk of losing that too. And I think for as much as the current administration is extremely anti-China and very, very worried about strategic competition with China, what they're doing by destroying USAID is actually taking off the table one of the most important tools that the U.S. has for projecting our values and projecting how they are unique. And that is a huge strategic comparative advantage vis-a-vis the Chinese economic and political model that we're about to lose. I've probably got time. Oh, actually, you know what? I don't have time for more because I've got to go do a CNN thing at 2 o'clock. I'm really sorry.
Congratulations.
Yeah, sorry. It is a real pleasure to talk to all of you. And I'm sorry I can't stay for, I will actually be around in the afternoon in the CEID offices. So if anybody wants to come by and chat, I'm happy to talk further, and I'm gonna have to go do this interview now to rail on the administration for what they're doing to USAID. This is real time, exactly. It's a real pleasure. I don't know what's gonna face you guys. I don't know how this is all gonna shake out, but I will say kind of the last word here. So I don't know what the humanitarian system and the global health system globally are gonna look like in a year. But I'm very confident that in 5 to 10 years, we're going to be building back something of what we had. So stick with it. It's going to be a rough next few years, but this is really important work, and it's really important to bring fresh talent, fresh thinking into it. So best of luck to all you guys too as you embark on that. And I know it's daunting, but give it a few years and it'll bounce back. Thanks, everybody.